Hi students, violence against women. Introduction. Women in the Indian society have been victims of humiliation, torture and exploitation since a long period of social organization and the family life. The attention of government, planning authorities, social workers and reformers are on the problems of women. One important problem concerned to women which has been ignored is violence against women. Women are being recognized as important, powerful and meaningful contributors to the life of men, but their conditions were pitiable few decades back. Institutional practices, ideologies and the existing norms in society contributed to their harassment with all the legislative measures in favor of women in our society after independence. The spread of education and women's economic independence, women still continue to be victims of violence. Women are kidnapped, raped, burnt, beaten and murdered. The objectives of the lesson are to understand the meaning of violence, to know the causes of violence, to study the types of violence, to understand the theoretical explanations of violence. Meaning of violence. The term violence has been described as an act of striking a person with the intent of causing harm or injury, but not actually causing it. According to Strauss, violent act as an act where there is the high potential of causing injury. It is an act of a person which encroaches upon the freedom of another. It is the overtly threatened or overtly accomplished application of force which results in the injury or destruction of persons or their reputation. Kemp defines violence as physically striking an individual and causing injury. The operational definition of violence may be given as force without overt or covert, used to wrest from an individual something that she does not want to give of her own free will and which causes her either physical injury or emotional trauma or both. Thus, kidnapping, murder, wife battering, sexual abuse, eve teasing and rape are some examples of violence against women. The characteristics of violence against women are: the violence against women may be categorized as the criminal violence, that is the rape, abduction, murder; the domestic violence, dowry, dowry deaths, wife battering, sexual abuse, maltreatment of widows and or elderly women; the social violence, forcing the wife or daughter-in-law for female foeticide, eve teasing, refusing to give a share to women in property, forcing a young widow to sati, harassing the daughter-in-law to bring dowry. The Police Research Bureau, Delhi, has referred to crime against women under two categories: the crimes under the Indian Penal Code and the crimes under the local and special laws. The 7 crimes under the IPC are kidnapping and abduction, homicide for dowry, rape, torture, the physical and mental, molestation, eve teasing and importation of girls up to 21 years of age. The 4 crimes under the local and special laws are commission of sati, dowry prohibition, immoral traffic and indecent representation of women. The Ministry of Home Affairs, then Police Research Bureau and the National Institute of Social Defense compiled records show the cases of criminal violence against women. Broadly speaking, rapes, molestations, kidnapping, eve teasing and dowry deaths occur very frequently. The cases of domestic violence like wife battering and forced incest with women of the household are never reported. Let us analyze the characteristics of 6 types of violence. Abduction and kidnapping. Kidnapping is taking away or enticing of a minor girl less than 18 years without the consent of the lawful guardian. Abduction is forcibly, fraudulently or deceitfully taking away of a woman with the intent of seducing her to illicit sex or compelling her to marry a person against her will. In kidnapping, the victim's consent is immaterial, but in abduction, the victim's voluntary consent condones the crime. The important characteristic of kidnapping or abduction reveals that the unmarried girls are more likely to be victims of abduction than married women. Abductors and victims are acquainted with each other in a large number of cases. The initial contact between the abductor and his victim frequently occurs in their own homes or neighborhood than in public places. Most often, only one person is involved in abduction. The two motives of abduction are sex and marriage. The sexual assaults go with abduction. The absence of parental control and disaffectionate relations in the family are crucial factors in contacts between the abductor and the victim, and girls run away from the home with some acquainted person. Rape. The problem of rape is serious in all countries. Age-wise, the percentage of victims of rape is highest in the age group of 16 to 30. Women who come from the lower middle class and who are the main breadwinners of their families bear sexual abuse quietly and without protest. The victims face social stigma and disgrace and suffer serious guilt pangs and personality disorders if they register protest. The important characteristics are: rape does not always occur between total strangers. The rape victim is known to her assailant. Situational rapes, single rapes involving only one offender, the group rapes, etc. Murder. The important characteristic of female murders and their victims. In large number of cases, murderers and their victims are members of the same family. Murderers belong to the age group of 25 to 40 years. Half of the victims are women with long-standing relationship with the male murderer. About half of the murdered women have children. Murderers belong to low status occupation and low income groups, unplanned and committed in the heat of passion or in a state of high emotionalism. Accomplice in planned murders is usually family members and petty domestic quarrels. Illicit relations, women, chronic illness are the motivations in women's murder. The dowry deaths. Women being harassed, tortured, killed or driven to suicide because of dowry. Dowry deaths, whether by way of suicide or by greedy husband and in-laws, have become a cause of concern for the legislatures, parents and courts and society as a whole. The Dowry Prohibition Act 1961 has banned the practice of dowry, but the problem exists yet. Middle class women suffer a higher rate of victimization than lower class or upper class women. The victims belong to up 21 to 24 years of age groups. They are mature physically, socially and emotionally also. The problem is more in an upper caste phenomenon than a lower caste problem. Before murder, several forms of harassment like humiliation are used against the brides, and the sociological factor in the causation of dowry death is the offender's environmental stress or the social tensions caused by factors endogenous and exogenous to his family. The killer's authoritarian personality, dominant nature, personality maladjustment, etc. The wife battering. Violence towards women in the context of marriage becomes more important when husband who has to support his wife beats her. The violence range from slaps and kicks to broken bones, torture and attempted murder. The violence may be related to drunkenness. She suffers humiliation in silence and take it as her destiny. She cannot revolt as she is in the fear that her parents refuse to own and keep her in their house. The wives younger to their husband are more than 5 years run a greater risk of being battered by their husbands. Low income women are more victimized. Family size and family composition have little correlation with wife battering. The important cause of wife battering is sexual maladjustment, emotional disturbances, jealousy and wife's passive timidity. The exposure to violence of the assaulter in his childhood is an important factor in wife battering. Illiterate wives are more vulnerable to husbands beating than the educated wives. Violence against widows. A widow may be one who has no issue and who has been widowed 1 or 2 years after her marriage. Widows have to face the problems of social, economic and emotional adjustment. The family members try to get rid of widows. A widow's self-image and the self-esteem of her sense of identity. The low status accorded to them by their in-laws and others in the family roles lowers their self-esteem. The stigma of widowhood itself negatively affects a woman and she falls in her own esteem. Violence against widows includes physical battering, emotional neglect, torture, verbal abuse, sexual abuse, deprivation of legitimate share in property and abuse of their children. The important characteristic of violence against widow is the young widows are more humiliated, harassed, exploited or victimized than the middle-aged widows. They become victims of fraudulent schemes fostered by unscrupulous members of their family who try to acquire their inherited property or life insurance benefits. The 3 most important motives of victimization are power, property and sex. The victims of violence. If we take all the cases of violence against women into consideration, we find that the victims of violence are generally those who feel helpless, depressed, have a poor self-image and suffer from self-devaluation, or those who are emotionally consumed by the perpetrators of violence, or who suffer from altruistic powerlessness, who live in stressful family situations, or who live in families which in sociological terms cannot be called normal families. That is, the families which are structurally complete, the both parents being alive and living together, economically secure, satisfying basic and subsidiary needs of members, functionally adequate, have rare quarrels and morally conformist, who lack social maturity or social interpersonal skills because of which they face behavioral problems, whose husbands or in-laws have pathological personalities and whose husbands are alcoholic. The 7 types of victimizers of women may be identified as they are those who have depressions, inferiority complex and low self-esteem, who have personality disorders and are psychopaths, who lack resources, skills and talents and have sociopath personality, who have stressful situations in family life, who have possessive, suspicious and dominant nature, who are victims of violence in childhood and who are frequent users of alcohol. The types of violence. If we were to develop a typology of violence against women, we may give 6 types of violence. The violence which is money oriented, violence which seeks power over the weak, violence which aims at pleasure seeking, violence which is the result of the perpetrator's pathology, violence which is result of stressful family situation and violence which is victim precipitated. The factors of violence are: violence against women can be explained on the basis of 3 factors: situations which bring about violent behavior, the characteristics of victims, the characteristics of victimizers. The causes of violence against women are victim provocation, intoxication, hostility towards women and situational urge. The victim's provocation. Women, by her behavior, become victim of violence. This is often unconscious, creates the situation of her own victimization. The victim either generates or triggers of the violent behavior of the offender. Her actions transform him into an assault aggressor, making him direct his criminal intentions against her. The intoxication. Violence occurs when the aggressors are intoxicated and in a wildly excited and belligerent state of mind, scarcely comprehending the likely fallout of their actions. The situational urge. The crime is committed neither because of the victim's behavior nor because of the offender's psychopathological personality, but rather because of the chance factors which creates such situations which lead to violence. The personality traits. Some traits of the violence prone personalities are identified as extremely suspicious, passionate, dominant, irrational, immoral, easily emotionally upset, jealous, possessive and unjust. Traits developed in the early life affect the aggressive behavior of a person in the adulthood. The aggressor being abused as a child or his exposure to violence during childhood. The theoretical explanation of violent behavior. In theoretical propositions on violence, whether violence is a normal response of provocation or whether it involves the acting out of some psychopathology or whether it acts as an instrument to obtaining some end or reward or whether it is a response consistent with norms supporting its use are explained. The psychiatric or psychopathological explanation focuses on the aggressor's personality characteristics as the chief determinant of criminal violent behavior. The socio-psychological explanation assumes that criminal violence can best be understood by analyzing the external environmental factors that exercise an impact on the individual aggressor. The motive attribution theory, self-attitude theory fall within the purview of socio-psychological level of analysis. The sociological school provides theory of subculture of violence, the learning theory, the anomie theory and the resource theory. The three factors play major role in prompting man to use violence against a woman. The perpetrator's history of abuse as a child, like unhappy upbringing, physical beating by parents, emotional rejection, stressful situations in the family, status frustrations. The generational theory proposes that growing up in a violent home increases the likelihood of an individual becoming violent as an adult. The social learning theory, according to proposition indulging in violent behavior as a method of conflict resolution or as a coping mechanism, is learnt behavior. Women's toleration of violence is explained in terms of learned helplessness theory and traditional socialization theory. These theories refers to women's imbibing traditional values and sex role ideology through socialization process that man is superior to women and that women has no right to protest. It is explained that some events occur in a woman's life with sufficient regularity, because of which she acquires feelings of depression, helplessness and or self-image and becomes to believe that she cannot escape abuse. Understanding violence or women's exploitation depends on her subjective perception of her status and role and her will, ability and efforts to challenge exploitation with courage. Women's exploitation depends on 5 things: the social background, age, education and training, the level of support, parents or in-laws and children, the expectations of others including husband, parents, laws, in-laws and children, the working colleagues, peers, etc. Economic base self-image being timid, bold, helpless, weak, strong, etc. The following are important sociological facts pointed out about the female victims of violence and exploitation. The structures as source of problems. The problems of females who are victims of violence arise from the functioning of social structures in which they live and work, and the stresses caused by family interactions and support systems. The traditions and of barriers of assertion. The involvement of victims in social roles and relationships after being victimized is dependent less on their own initiative and self-confidence and more on the will of heads of families, of procreation and orientation, and social pressures. They are: the traditional culture discourages female victims from taking to assertive social engagements outside the home. The resource deprivation and suffering of self. Resources like higher education and work with wages increase victims' self-image and self-esteem, which considerably change her relations with others and also enable her to face the strain of transition of life and recovery and adjust herself in family and society. The attachment. A large number of victims of violence overcome their feelings of being isolated and condemned by attaching themselves to some love object, social service, the religious commitments, etc. The structural suffocation factors which prevent victims of violence from renewing, redeeming, restoring, reviving and revitalizing their lives like more in social structures than in their personalities. The negation of revolt. A few young and independent victims have a secret desire of rebelling and adopting modern methods of adjustment, but they fail to rebel for the fear that their husbands, in-laws and parents might sever ties with them, and they are also scared of being shunned and ostracized by their kin and friends. The self-esteem situation. Victims with sloppy emotions lead a suppressed life, but victims with courage of conviction, character and consciousness chart their own course in their working life. The adjustment phases. The adjustment of victims identifies under 4 phases are: shock and pain, removing pain, avoidance and humiliation, and adaptation. Phase 1. Shock and pain depends on nature of violence against women and also factors like age, education, employment and emotional attachment. Phase 2. Removing pain depends on the support and security of the parents. Phase 3. Avoidance or humiliation by family, kin, friends and acquaintances. The phase 4. Adaptation through religious consolation, accepting social challenge, neutralization and attachment and identity change. Summary of the lesson. From the lesson, we have learnt about violence, which refers to an act of striking a person with the intent of causing harm or injury, and it is overtly threatened or overtly accomplished application of force which results in the injury or destruction of the persons or their reputation. Violence against women is the concern of the society. There are many legislations and police actions on the violence. In spite of active role of state as well as other organizations, we experience violence in some form or the other. The violence range from rape of a girl to wife beating, dowry deaths, etc. We have come across the various types and causes of violence against women. The theoretical explanations have made us understand from different aspects why the violence happens, varying with situations and traits of a person. Given the support from family and society, women can combat with the exploitation. Thank you all of you.